Hey man, Rick, you've got no audio on the live stream.
Really?
Yeah.
Rick, thank you for letting
You've got no audio on the. You can hear me though, apparently.
I'll stop the live stream and restart it. Hello, friends. Host Eric here with attempt 2 of Race in America. The racists, the racial ones, and racism. In the aftermath of Charlottesville. Bum 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 bum. Thanks to Kestrel pointing out that my first attempt had no audio in it. This one now does. And it's going to be so much better than the audioless one. Anywho, my central point about race, of course, is that it doesn't exist. Not really. And I guess I should maybe begin by stating my own race. I am transracial. I have been, I guess, white originally. I started out that way, I guess. Somebody else told me that. And so I just sort of accepted it as true until I realized that I was actually an African American. I was black for a while. And then I said, you know what? This doesn't feel right to me. And I became Chinese. That worked out great for a while. I got free karate. And then after that, I did become a Mexican for a while, which was cool. But finally, I settled on my actual race, which is famous person. So Kestrel is also racially a famous person. Now, he may be biracial. He may also be something else, like black or something. I don't know. But he is the race famous person. And one of the advantages of being racially famous person is that it's falsifiable. Unlike other races, you can falsify whether you're a member of the race famous person. Because to be a member of the race famous person, you have to have been on mic or camera at some point in the Raw channel or the main channel. So, Kestrel is racially famous person. He might also, as I said, identify as something else. Now, I currently don't identify as any race other than famous person. But here's the good news, everybody. We know race isn't actually really a thing because if you choose to identify as African American, nobody can falsify it. If you choose to then identify as Chinese the next day, nobody can falsify it. The reason nobody can falsify it is there is no genetic test for race, and individuals are more genetically similar to individuals outside of their race than they are to individuals within their race. Now, one should note the following. It is obviously the case that people who are closely related look more like one another than they do look like people who are distantly related. So, for example, if you take everybody in Candace's rather large family and look at them together, you'll notice that they are all heavyset, pretty much. There aren't any skinny Gonzaleses from Candace's family. They're all fairly heavy people. And they all have kind of similar toned skin color. That doesn't make them a race, right? You say, well, it makes them part of the same race. Well, no. We would call them probably Mexicans or something like that. But they're no more, that's no more a legitimate designation than to say that they as a small group are a race. If we're going to group people, put a bunch of Chinese people next to a bunch of white people, and you say group them, the obvious visual cue is, well, they all have black hair and slanty eyes and yellow skin, and they all have round eyes and different colors hair and light and sort of peachish gray skin. Okay, well, all race is then really, people say, well, it's a social construct. It's not even that. It's just an example of, it's a manifestation of human fallacious bias towards visual stimuli over other kind of stimuli. That's all it is. You can't use it for anything useful as a designation at all. And in fact, anytime it comes up, no matter what you're saying about it, in terms of if you're, except for this kind of thing, like a meta critique of it, but no matter which side you're on the race issue, you are part of the problem. Because if you're celebrating your own African Americanness, you're part of the problem. If you're celebrating your own whiteness, you're part of the problem. If you are critiquing somebody else's brownness, you're part of the problem. If you are advocating on behalf of their brownness, you're part of the problem. Because think of it this way. Let's start back at slavery. Okay? Slavery is not about race. It was never about race. So, like, back at the beginning of the country, we had these plunderers, these criminal guys who had more guns than other people. And they said, hey, let's go get those guys over there from Africa. They don't really speak English, so they can't really nobody will really hear them complain. And let's force them at gunpoint to do labor and then steal the wealth that's generated from their labor, so we don't have to work. We'll be plunderers. And so they come back with these people and they're plunderers, and they say, well, hey, let's see, look what we're doing, ha ha. And somebody else goes, well, why is it okay to do that to these people? And they go, oh, they're a different race. Well, what the fuck's that? It's kind of like a subspecies of human, but they're basically not really human. It's fine. Okay, so we have. Go ahead, Kestrel.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at any kind of phylogenetic definition of something, let's look at just like biologically species. It's, the appeal that you're making to the fact that race is somewhat vague is that actually it does apply to everything in biological categorization, because when you look close enough, if you look close enough at all the details, just like, the evolution issue, finding species sort of between other species, there isn't species between other species, because ultimately everything happens so gradually.
Okay, but Kestrel, listen, but hold on.
Defining line between species,
but hold on.
When you look at things closely, it's too vague.
Hold on. We have a binary definition of a species, which is to say, can mate and produce viable offspring. It's binary. You either meet that standard or you don't.
No, it's not. Only in the context of when you're looking. Only in the context of where you're looking at it, but broadly, when one species crosses into another species,
okay, I'm not talking about evolution. I'm talking
that
about
doesn't
taxonomy.
Meet that binary definition that you're talking about, because when one species cross, they can mate at all times.
Okay, listen. I'm not talking about evolution. I'm saying the taxonomy. We use a rule to divide the group.
Yeah. And I'm saying that taxonomy is always going to break down when you actually look at it in the correct amount of detail. There is no taxonomy that exactly explains.
But no, Kestrel, obviously taxonomies are approximations, true. But I'm drawing a clear distinction here. I'm saying an approximation like gender can be falsified. An approximation like height can be falsified. An approximation like race cannot. It's a clear distinction. It's a real distinction, and it matters.
What?
I'm saying there's a difference between taxonomical designations that can be falsified and those that cannot. For example, height is a taxonomical designation. They can be falsified. Species is as well. Race is not. It's a real distinction. It's a real difference in the nature of the idea. It's the distinction I'm making, and you've not responded to it in a way that defeats it because of what I just said.
No, can you go through that again?
I'm saying that taxonomical distinctions come in different kinds. There's kinds that can be falsified and kinds that cannot be falsified. So a taxonomical distinction that can be falsified would be height, for example. It's not because I actually am 6'4".
Yeah,
it's
but
because we all
no,
agree.
I think that I get you now. But I disagree that I would still contend that wherever you have a distinction, a taxonomical distinction, then you are, it's only a matter of the level of detail that you are looking at it with. For instance, you could find.
But that's not true because there are two different metrics.
Primates.
But look, there's sliding scale and binary metrics. In other words, there are some things that are like a light switch that's on off, and there are some things that are like a light switch that is a dimmer. And the dimmer stuff, you're right. All the dimmer stuff is like that, but all the light switch stuff is not like that.
But it's clearly not. Race is clearly visually apparent. So it's almost, you could almost appeal to
that's actually the best argument you could make right there, is that the racial thing that we're talking about is visually evident. It is what it appears to be, and that's it. Okay, well, that's a reasonably strong argument, except we all understand that people that there's the ability of an individual to be one for them to be a member of a family that self-identifies as a given race, but appear to be to other people the general consensus about what looks like a different race. So, in other words,
well, the exception would prove the rule then.
Okay, but additionally, there's the factor that if a race were an actual designation like gender, it wouldn't be possible for somebody to be biracial. Now, in that case, the exception really does prove the rule for gender. So, in other words, there are hermaphrodites, but in that case, the exception proves the rule.
It wouldn't be if gender. I mean, somebody can be. Yeah, well, they say hermaphrodites, but I mean, that just to me is another category, and that is inherent upon the issue that we're talking about with race. You have race, but you can be biracial. It doesn't seem to
compare to species. My daughter is 1/4 Mexican. Compared to species, you can have a liger, but it can't reproduce, and you don't get increasing variations of shade in between tiger and lion, right? It doesn't work like that. Whereas race does.
But that's just testament to the difference between race and.
It's testament to what I'm saying, that race is bullshit. It's not a very real distinction.
Well, I mean, it does seem self-evident to me, even if it's not necessarily what you want it to be or what some racist from the 1800s wants it to be.
I don't want it to be anything. I'm describing it accurately. I'm describing this phenomenon of attributing race to people accurately.
But to deny it is to then say, oh, well, clearly they're not an African American when you're looking at an African American.
I will talk to any person who self-identifies as African American and be happy to tell them that is make-believe. You are not African American.
Well, they may be using the wrong terminology for themselves.
Wrong ontological concept. It doesn't exist as a real thing. As I explained in the last video without any audio, I'm the archpastor of the Yaylorian Church. I definitely am that. It's an important part of my ontology and my identity. And yet, I would never expect you to say that it was real in the physical world, in the sense that you could say, take my blood out and test it and see, yeah, I see you have the genetic marker for Archpastor of the Aelorian Church. You wouldn't expect that, right? People think you can test for race. You can't. There's no genetic test for race. But most people think you can, for some reason. Regardless, the point is, my ontology does include Archpastorhood of the Aelorian Church. And it is real to me, and it's important to me. But that's you understand the limits of which I'm willing to make claims about it. I don't say that because I'm Archpastor, I have some natural attributes that are associated with everybody who's part of that thing or something. I just
Well, you say there's no genetic test for race, but there might not be one genetic marker that says what that looks like tells you the race. But in reality, it's there are various different markers that can determine
that you could arbitrarily say, let's use this set, or arbitrarily say, let's use this set of similar markers, or arbitrarily say, let's use this set. You could do that to attribute race to somebody, but that's you choosing to name sets of data arbitrarily certain things.
Well, that's everything, though, isn't it? Well, there is no name that comes out of the ether, Eric. There is no name that comes out of the ether and tells us this is this. All names are detached from the object of which they're described.
Okay, but Kestrel, listen, it's a very big difference between naming me 6'4", which is a binary name that's either approximate, close enough true or close enough false. It doesn't have any gray things, right? You might be able to say, well, actually, you're 6'4", 1 millimeter, or something like that. But if I say I'm approximately 6'4", that's falsifiable. Okay. Now, the difference is race is not falsifiable. So there's no way for you to even attribute a race to me or not a race to me without first defining the term in a particular way that's unique to you and your definition of it. So there's no shared definition. If you find a set of markers, like genetic markers, and say this represents Chinese people, then other scientists won't agree with you that that's the same set of genetic markers. And if you say, here are the qualities, the physical appearance qualities that most line up with black people or Chinese people, you'll get agreement about some broad, simple things, but if you ask for a lot of detail, you'll get no agreement. Whereas if you're talking about something like, I am a male, you'll get general consensus about the definitional constraints of that term.
Well, you would have done in the past, but I don't. I think that you yourself are drawing the arbitrary line about what may be considered.
It's not arbitrary.
It's describing something which is real, and there is consensus upon many things. And just because like everything, you could use that argument for anything. I mean, science really doesn't understand everything that it's talking about. It's got explanations, but when you get down to the details, as you just said, there is not broad consensus about the way things are.
Okay,
so it's
not just broad consensus. It's not just consensus, right? So I've established a couple different things here. That it's not definitionally anything to say what a white person is. In fact, I'll read you Congress's definition of a white person, so it's obvious how ridiculous it is. Okay?
Well, I'm not going to take any appeals to what the government says.
No, I mean, look. All right, for everybody who's watching the live stream, you can see this. In the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896, reaffirmed the legitimacy of having separate railroad cars for black people and white people. One thing we often forget about the case is that Homer Plessy's argument was that he was white. The court said in its decision that if he be a white man and be assigned to the color coach, he may have his action for damages from the company for being deprived of his so-called property. Because they decided that being a white person was part of a white person's property. So in 1921, the powers that be decided they needed a definition of a white person, and here's what they came up with. A white person has been held to include an Armenian born in Asiatic Turkey, a person of but 1/16 Indian blood, and a Syrian, but not to include Afghans, American Indians, Chinese, Filipinos, Hawaiians, Hindus, Japanese, Koreans, Negroes, nor does a white person include a person having 1/4 of African blood, a person in whom Malay blood predominates, a person whose father was a German and whose mother was a Japanese, a person whose father was a white Canadian and whose mother was an Indian woman, or a person whose mother was a Chinese and whose father was the son of a Portuguese father and a Chinese mother. That's spectacular. How do you define white person, Kestrel?
Yeah, well, a white person is self-evident. White race is self-evident, but if you want to nitpick about various outliers, that's something for you to do. But the self-evident nature of the difference between a white person and a black person is as clear as black and white. If you want to deny it on the basis that you can draw, you want to hold some, you want to decide what the arbitrary definitions are. That's up to you.
But
everyone else is going to carry on, Eric. Everyone else is going to carry on functionally.
That's not what's happening. You're not representing accurately what's happening. I am not arbitrarily defining anything. There's nothing arbitrary about what I'm saying. I'm actually pointing out that a designation that we might make, such as by age, by height, by profession, by gender, by any number of other things, genetic and otherwise, that we might make, you cannot find a single other example that we take seriously that has as little support for its existence as race. It can't be falsified. There's no consensus about the definition of any given race, and the best you can come up with is it's self-evident, except we don't all agree upon it, so then it's totally subjective as well. This is a real distinction I'm making. It's not like I'm just saying, well, Eric, it's all the same. Your argument is the same as what you're saying these people are guilty of. No, it's not. So I want to talk about what actually started me wanting to make this video this morning, which is reading about the Charlottesville violence and the protests there and stuff. Now, this is an example of the stupidity of shit in America in general. First of all, they wanted to march. Let them march. Don't counter-protest. If you want to show your contempt for their ideas, here's what you should do. Stay home. Don't do anything. Nobody show up. Nobody's watching them. Why? Because who wants to watch a bunch of fucking morons shouting about pretend stuff? The oologs will kill us! The oologs will kill us! What the fuck are they talking about? I don't know, some make-believe shit in their head. If you pay them no attention at all, they'll cease to have any viability as an organization because they'll just feel foolish. As they should. Let's direct hateful energies by a group politics modality about a made-up label and say we hate those people. Well, I mean, it's just so silly. And the counter-protesters, they're like, we support the rights of oologs. There are no fucking oologs, you morons. So, look, let's talk about the cops shooting people. Cops shooting unarmed people in America is a fucking epidemic. And the problem is very simple. We have allowed ourselves to operate in a legal framework that considers the mental state of the cop uh, as the deciding factor as to whether he was justified in shooting somebody. Now, it's always sort of an issue in a self-defense case, sure, but cops aren't making self-defense claims. They're saying, I had a reasonable fear for my life and therefore was justified in shooting somebody to death. In other words, I was afraid he might be violent, therefore I was justified in being violent. Of course, you absolutely were not justified in being violent until until it's a responsive action. Cops are subject to the same fundamental moral law as everybody else. If you are the one who initiates force, you are the aggressor. Now, the exception would be if a cop is executing an arrest warrant and the person, say, lies limp or something, then the cop will be justified in using the amount of force necessary to move the person. Because in that instance, the person who has committed the crime has forfeited some of their rights. And they need to cooperate or be subject to the just application of force by society. When we talk about race, we encourage cops to shoot unarmed people because we're focusing on their mental state, their mental processes. So instead of the cops going, yeah, I'm not sure why we have all these cops murdering people, and we accept that it's murder because they initiated the force, that makes them the aggressor, and the person wasn't even armed, so the proportionality of the force used, even if he had been the aggressor, would have been out of proportion. But regardless, we acknowledge that's a big problem. We're going to solve that. Instead, we're talking about whether the cop had a legitimate fear for his life or not. When we do that, we say we've lost the framework. We said cops aren't people. They're above the law. They're above natural law. They're not subject to account for their moral actions. When we say, oh, the cops are racist, we say, here you go, cops, keep doing it. Because now the cops can focus on whether or not the cops are racist. Oh, we did all these training programs to help our cops be less racist. And we did all these demographic studies to show that black people are not stopped at an unreasonable rate against white people. You're not focused on the right thing, then you enable them to continue doing it. Who cares what the race of the person is? Attack the fact that a police officer who is supposed to be there to protect and serve and to take risks is trying to justify the fact that he killed a man because the man reached for his waistband and the cop was afraid for his life. But that can't possibly be accepted as a justification for such violence, ever. If it can, then all instances of violence by police will be so justified. There's never going to be an instance where an officer says, you know what, guys? I really didn't have a good reason to shoot that guy. My bad. There will never be such an instance. If we're spending time talking about the race of the driver and the race of the cop, then we're saying it's more okay for a black cop to kill a black person, a dark-skinned cop to kill a dark-skinned person, then that must have been okay. It must have been okay because, after all, this problem is racism. not unjustified violence, not a system of laws that has come to protect some individuals when they murder people for no reason. And it protects them because we think it matters what their mental processes are. We think it matters if they're racist or not. We think it matters if they were afraid for their life or not. If we're talking about that shit, we're contributing to the problem. So, go ahead, Kestrel.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, Eric, the way that you're talking about it, like, oh, if we say this, if we talk about that, it implies that there's some kind of two-way street in terms of, any conversation that you might be having, and the government. And it's just not like that, in my opinion. The government dictates what happens, and the media does what it's told and has the conversations that it's told to have by the government, and we don't have anything to do with it. So what we talk about is of no consequence.
We're part of the media as well. I'm part of the media too. We're having a conversation right now.
I
am not. Look, I may not be the mainstream media. I may not be a big name media person, but there are lots of other media sources like me in between me and CBS. People get their news from lots of different places. There's no possible way that the government can, as a general rule, dictate the nature of media coverage in a free society like America anyway, on a regular basis. I'm not denying to you that there are powerful means by which certain aspects of the government can engage in active misinformation. But even then, the way that they do it is by including a bunch of stories that say a bunch of different wrong things to muddy the waters. They don't go visit the offices of ABC and say, you must do this, or blah, 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 like you're imagining. It's simply they take advantage of their own access to certain abilities to publish certain things in certain places, to plant certain stories, and they let the media companies do their normal thing. Now,
I think you don't. I don't think you're aware of how large the problem is. If you've not been paying attention, ever since 9/11, no government, no media, mainstream media organization has ever told anybody the truth about anything. Okay, it's never come out and bothered to do anything except make people who were telling the truth appear to be ridiculous. Well, so the extent of which the media is manipulated, and it starts off, by the way, that the fact that the media get their news from one source. The government tells them what's what. They give them access to all the outlets. They give them access to the.
Not true. Have you? I mean, I watch the local news, for example. What I see are the local news team, Team 7, sending their people to a fire. I can see the smoke up from my house. The reason they're covering that piece of news is because it's actually happening. And they've sent actual people to go look at it and tell me.
And they are actual people as well. There's a lot of, just like, hey, Iron Man is, not 100% CGI. Robert Downey Jr. actually shows up there and gets filmed. Wow. Obviously, the extent to which they manipulate you is not going to be 100% CGI, is it? But the fact is that
we agree most local news stories are real.
No local news network has ever turned around and told you, hey, Building 7 fell down its own footprint due to some fires, and that's fucking bullshit.
That's true, Kestrel, but my point is simply because they're not telling that stuff doesn't mean what they are saying is dictated by the government. And we know it's not because, like I said, I live in a big city. I see the local news coverage. I know why they cover those things. They are of interest to me. It's what people want to watch. Why there's so much weather coverage. The thing is, the marketplace is the proof. It says if people with more and more media options, if people don't want to watch something, they won't watch it. So fundamentally, what every media producer has to do is make media that people want to watch. That's the only thing that works. You can't you can do the sort of misinformation schemes that I described, and I don't doubt that the government did that about 9/11. I'm not opposing you. I'm actually with you on 9/11. 9/11 is clearly to me an example of a government conspiracy, and there are legitimate conspiracies in government. They do happen because we have organizations like the CIA and NSA who are set up to conspire.
But listen, you need to, it's okay saying 9/11. Look at everything that happened after 9/11 that was contingent upon 9/11. Also lies, also followed through by the media, like the good little sheep, the good little lapdogs that they are for the government, and up to modern day when you have things like Sandy Hook fairly recently. Everything is.
But Castro, you are using the watchmaker's fallacy. Just because things turned out as they did doesn't mean they were directed to be that way. Okay, the fact is, look at the economy as an example. Every business gets what it needs from.
The watchmaker fallacy only applies if you, don't have a watchmaker and you don't have a watch. I mean, are you going to tell me that you find a watch in the forest and you don't think that there's a watchmaker?
Okay, but here's what I'm saying. That the state of affairs right now, you like to see everything as linked and being centrally directed, but it doesn't work that way. The reality that we currently are in is an emission of a confluence of multiple agents, each acting independently. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not possible for people sometimes to conspire and conspire successfully, but you vastly overestimate the ability of individuals to conspire to direct from a central location what happens. We see what that looks like. That's like North Korea, okay? That's centrally dictated.
North Korea is a TV movie.
Oh my God!
Have you not seen the Otto Beerman hoax? Come on, that guy was
Castro,
acting his fucking.
Castro, if that is true, then tell me this. When I was in China, in Shanghai, and I was there, I saw Shanghai myself, so Shanghai is real, okay? Now, when I was there, I considered I considered taking a trip to North Korea because I thought this is my chance. I'm here in China, and I emailed a company in China that sets up those trips. Now, I ended up not going, but that person harassed me a bunch. They really wanted to sell me this trip to North Korea, and I am quite sure. I've been to the airport in China. I've seen the board that says Pyongyang as a destination, that those planes do go to North Korea.
And I saw 2 planes going into 2 towers on 9/11 as well. But that doesn't mean that it was exactly what I was told it was, does it?
I'm not assuming that North Korea is exactly what I'm told it is. However, I am correctly describing North Korea as a place that more or less matches the description we understand it to be. The reason I know this is because I've read, I've seen regular people's talking about, regular people's discussion of their tourist trip to North Korea. And they're not, you might say, well, we don't know they're regular people. Well, okay, at a certain point, though, Castro, the notion that so many individual people would choose to facilitate this fiction in North Korea when it's easy enough to falsify. And people like you and all kinds of other individual people around the world are desperate to falsify the official story, desperate to falsify it.
Yeah.
There's good reason to believe it's real.
Because there is somewhere called North Korea, but it's a TV movie. What you call North Korea is a TV movie. I mean, there's no other explanation for these daft CGI rockets that the fucking BBC keeps putting that one, these 5 rockets flowing up perfectly like fucking, I don't know, somebody got a hold of Cinema 4D for the first time.
It's probably North Korea state TV's footage. But look,
yeah, it is. But that's only supported by China. It's supported by China and the US.
Okay, fine, but it doesn't change the fact that life in North Korea is more, for the average citizen, is extremely rigidly controlled by the state. And I also want to say, I saw in China a much lighter version of that. My AA meeting that I went to in China, I talked to the expats who were in there, and they said it was just within the last year that they hadn't been busted in a year, basically, but that they got busted about once a year by the cops because it's illegal to hold a group meeting without getting a permit from the government. And they won't give a permit to AA because of the religious aspect of it.
Okay, well, for the purposes of the debate, which we've actually gone quite far away from now, you could just say, instead of somewhere like Korea, you could say China.
Okay, but my whole point of making the distinction is to show that we do know what it looks like to a certain extent when there is an unjust attempt to direct from a central source the behavior of individuals too much. And we have an example of what it looks like when people are more or less left to their own devices to make their own decisions and follow their own paths. And that latter one is the society in which we live. It doesn't mean we don't have nefarious characters. It doesn't mean that we don't have nefarious characters attempting to do a lot of the shit you're saying. It does mean that reality, an assessment of reality, understands the limit of links. So in other words, individual agents have limited capacity to control other individual agents, and thus consensus of action is much more difficult to attain than consensus of ideation. And as a consequence, there's a limited ability for conspiracies to, quote unquote, to work. They need to have a very narrow scope of goal, and they need to be smartly executed. 9/11 is an example of, as far as I can tell, a conspiracy, which is to say, if you looked after 9/11 happened, what you saw was shitloads of bad 9/11 conspiracy theories. Bad ones that drowned out the legitimacy of the actual facts. So in other words, if you commit a crime and you want to cover it up, put out a bunch of information showing different ways in which the crime could have been committed by whoever, We don't know. Could be this way. Here's a good thing to do if you want to show that you're innocent of a crime. Put out ridiculous accusations. We know he's guilty of the crime because he's a Martian and he's got lizard eyes. And then people will go, oh, look at the people who are accusing him. They're morons. So obviously it's not the case. It's only kooks, crackpots and kooks that think that.
Here's the thing. Yeah, here's the thing though. You are underestimating the extent of Operation Mockingbird, which has been going since the 50s, which was a large-scale manipulation of the media. And you think that they just stopped. How effective would the manipulation of the media be? Okay, all they have to do is indoctrinate these people. And we know people like Anderson Cooper, you know what I mean? They're practically openly Mockingbird.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Are Obama and Trump both parts of the same plan?
They are far less important than people give them credit for. I mean, if you look at Obama, the way Obama was talking to not even Putin, he was like, I mean, this is what they showed us. So they show us these things. Do you remember when he was talking to the Russian prime minister?
I want a simple question.
Well, if he's groveling to the Russian prime minister, he's not as important.
Answer a simple question. Were both Obama and Trump directed or dictated by a central group or power figure who is executing a plan?
The CIA, yeah, they always have the last say, basically.
So basically, the CIA is responsible for both Obama and Trump.
They're not going to be able to do anything without the CIA basically controlling it. And they don't really have that much of a difference between them, to be honest. The left-right thing is an absolute joke.
Trump and Obama have a shitload of difference between them.
They really don't. Look at the way they just go. It just goes back and forth. Look at the way they, Obama opens ties to Cuba, and look, Trump closes ties to Cuba. That's that sorted out. Zero sum.
All right. Well, I want to get back to race. So, I don't want to argue conspiracy stuff. There is a certain mechanics to it, though, Castro, that you're not understanding. And
No, it's not that at all. The mechanics is just the mechanics. The reality of it is that the media is being broadly penetrated by the CIA, and that's been known for years. And that's why they never tell you about 9/11 or Sandy Hook or the Otto Bierman nonsense, which they all carry on with.
Okay, well, friends.
I know it's hard. It's hard. The last thing I'll say on that is it's hard to accept that it's on the scale that it's on. But when you look at the facts all laid out, the extent to which they carry on with the lies and never tell you the truth, then you have to accept it, regardless of your assessment of the mechanics or not. Let's talk about race.
Okay, so yeah, let's talk about race. I will go here and look at this live chat and see. No, not much going on except for Bojo. Oh, Bojo. Trolling trolls. Okay, so bad video settings. Your video settings are bad, Eric. Alright, so back to race. The thing is, we had this Charlottesville march, and it was Nazis who came to march. And they're like white power people or whatever. And then there's a big uproar over who caused the violence. And people are upset at Trump for saying there was violence by both sides. And that he shouldn't have said that somehow. But there obviously was violence on both sides. I read enough like tweets and stuff and this is how you know that that there are people trying to do good reporting out there. They say it evaluated the question of, well, who did start the violence? And they used as evidence various tweets and interviews with various people on both sides. They presented both examples from both perspectives, people from the neo-Nazi side and people from the leftists, I guess you'd call them. And, it's pretty convincing to me that when you get two parties who are screaming obscenities at each other and a fistfight ensues, that there's violence on both sides. And people are furious at Trump for saying that. But it's obviously true. So here's a problem that we have is we want reality to be more clearly than we want accuracy to be. So we'd like our realities to match with whatever sort of ideas that we've attached to. But it never will work like that until we attach foremost to clarity of objective analysis. That is to say, understanding in ways that can be parsed down and explained, that can be established as substantiated or not substantiated, things like that. When we prioritize that, then all the other problems go away. So, number one job of everybody post Charlottesville in America, as far as I'm concerned, is to argue in favor of accuracy over your side Group politics are the means by which society fails. To the extent that our government and our courts or our legal interpretation of things, to the extent that those fail to uphold a system that is framed around the individual and his rights, then we do harm to each other because we force each other to be parts of groups that we don't necessarily want to be. When the Nazis come to march in your town and you show up to yell at them, you're saying, let's do this again. I love this. Of course, that's what they want, right? They want their ideology to be legitimized by the strength of your response, because it doesn't stand muster on its merits. So they don't want you to deal with it on its merits. But if you do deal with it on its merits, then you wouldn't show up, because there's nothing worth arguing about there. It's just they don't have any good arguments. They don't have any good arguments about race because they can't even define it. They can't establish that it exists. They can't falsify it. They can't prove themselves to be white people. So why in the world would we bother to care about their opinions about this sort of stuff? It's like if I held a march that said, everybody who hasn't been on Talking with Famous People is bad, nobody would counter-protest because they just think I was ridiculous. If I continued holding these protests time after time and nobody ever showed up, I would start to feel kind of foolish myself. I'd wonder why I was protesting and who I was protesting to. I knew what I was protesting about, but I don't know who I'm protesting to. And neither should those white supremacists. Who are they protesting to? White people? Me? Protesting about what? That you don't like black people? Who? Which black people? Everybody with dark skin? If I'm tan, do you like me less? If I eat a lot of watermelon and fried chicken and drink grape soda and get some relaxer for my hair and get tan, do you hate me? My hair's relaxed enough.
I think you make a good point about them, just the showing up sort of gives them legitimacy, gives their argument, or not even their argument, because, the white supremacists, white nationalists who are showing up there aren't really making an argument. They're just they just have a goal in mind they would prefer, but it legitimizes anyone showing up. Sort of gives them see we've got a good point here, because these blacks and these liberals keep showing up and they want to oppose us. They want us to not not be proud of our race and what have you. And of course the left, they come out with things like white lives don't matter and things like that. I heard that, and I just laugh really at that, because it's
let's talk about Black Lives
silliness.
Matter. Let's talk about that garbage. All right, so
I don't know.
if you are any individual human being who supports Black Lives Matter, you love it when cops kill black people. Okay, let me make that clear, because you are part of the problem. That cops should be held to account for using violence in an unjustified fashion. We should define that by who initiates the violence. The initiator is the aggressor. If the police officer uses self-defense, that means he has been attacked first. If he shoots somebody not in self-defense, then he is guilty of murder, or at least manslaughter. Now, here's the problem. We, as a society, spend time worrying about the race of the cop and the defendant and about the mental state of the cop and the defendant, such that the suspect, the cop and the suspect, such that if we say, oh, a white cop shot another unarmed black guy, all we're doing there is saying, here's another way for you guys to keep getting away with this. You can talk about your mental state some more. You can show me that the cop wasn't racist, so therefore it was okay for him to murder somebody? Oh, who the fuck cares if he's racist? It's not relevant. Are you also saying, oh, well, it must have been a good shoot. It was a black cop and a black guy, so it wasn't racist, so it must have been a good shoot. It must have been fine. Well, we're not actually evaluating the reality of things. The simple question is this. Did the cop get attacked? Not, in other words, is the cop's violence responsive? Not did the cop fear for his life or was the cop racist? Those aren't relevant. The cop feared for his life. If it's okay, if it's acceptable for a cop to say he was legitimately afraid for his life and therefore had to kill this guy who turned out not to be a threat, who was just reaching for his phone after all. If it's ever okay for a cop to get away with killing somebody because they were afraid for their life without having any actually having been attacked, what we're saying is every single time a cop shoots somebody that's totally murder and unjustified, he will say that. He's going to say, I was afraid for my life. They will always make that claim. And then it will be up to us to win the argument about the other individual's mental state in court. That's a terrible, 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 terrible thing to do. It's not relevant what his mental state was, and it doesn't justify his violence even if he was afraid for his life. We hire cops to go take those risks, to deal with criminals. Just being afraid for your life is not good enough reason to shoot somebody. You have to be undergoing an attack, having your violence needs to be responsive. You got to either, or the closest you can get to a non-responsive violence is justified is somebody's brandishing a weapon. Somebody's brandishing a gun at you, pointing it at you. You can shoot them. Otherwise, if the guy's got the gun down by his side, no, that is not adequate cause to shoot somebody. So, I mean, the cowardice of police officers, if we are to accept that this fear for the life thing is legitimate, they are constantly terrified for their lives. They need to find another job. They're in constant terror. We have cops who shoot chihuahuas because the chihuahua runs up to them and is barking. And they say, well, I was afraid I was going to get bit. So that justifies me shooting this chihuahua. They have to be the most cowardly bunch of little girls I've ever heard of. They're constantly shooting dogs. Anyway, don't help police officers unjustly kill people by caring about race.
Yeah, but the thing is, though, the police officer thing notwithstanding, I think that your demands for a really concrete, definition of race, might be you're asking too much, really, because what race is about group security. It's about tribal. It's tribal. It's the idea of race.
I don't deny
it's going to predate the idea of race, the necessity of conceptualizing race is going to predate the necessity for conceptualizing the kind of detail that you're demanding.
I mean, I disagree with you.
It's more fundamental than that. It's a need for people to be in groups and to defend those groups. Since those groups they're necessary. You can't say, "Oh, let's stop thinking in terms of race and it's going to go away," because it's not going to go away. People feel that they are a certain race. You might be able to provide, it's like there's a chap who I know who found out that he was Jewish. He thought he was white, but then again, you can come up with a combination of Jewish people are white. Well, whatever. The point is that you can have a misunderstanding about your race in some kind of concrete fashion, but the idea of race, it's almost a feeling conceptualization, and people who lead with feeling don't need to have the kind of rigid clarity for definition that you're talking about. And since they don't need it, they don't want it, and it's not going to work to demand that they ask for it. It's a better option to simply accept that there is such a thing as race, and more come at it from the angle of let's all live together in peaceful, and argue against the idea of reparations and things like that, or the kind of racial politics. Argue against racial politics rather than the existence of races, because you're never going to convince anybody that they're not a certain race.
All right. Well, I'm surprised to see that people are as far along in this issue as they are. Let me read you a Wikipedia article on race here. It says, race as a social construct is the classification of humans into groups based on physical traits, ancestry, genetics, or social relations, or the relations between those groups. First used to refer to speakers of a common language and then to denote national affiliations. By the 17th century, race began to refer to physical phenotypical traits. The term was often used in a general biological taxonomic sense, starting from the 19th century, to denote genetically differentiated human populations defined by phenotype. Social conceptions and groupings of race vary over time, involving folk taxonomies that define essential types of individuals based on perceived traits. Scientists consider biological essentialism obsolete and generally discourage racial explanations for collective differentiation in both physical and behavioral traits. Even though there is a broad scientific agreement that essentialist and typological conceptualizations of race are untenable, scientists around the world continue to conceptualize race in widely different ways, some of which have essentialist implications. While some researchers use the concept of race to make a distinction among fuzzy sets of traits or observable differences in behavior, others in the scientific community suggest that the idea of race often is used in a naive or simplistic way and argue that among humans, race has no taxonomic significance by pointing out that all living humans belong to the same species and subspecies. Since the second half of the 20th century, the association of race with the ideologies and theories that grew out of the work of 19th century anthropologists and physiologists has led to the use of the word race itself becoming problematic. Although still used in general context, race has often been replaced by less ambiguous and emotionally charged related concepts, populations, peoples, ethnic groups, communities, depending on context. I'm impressed. I didn't know that everybody knew this shit. Contemporary scholars agree that race was a recent invention and that it was essentially a folk idea, not a product of scientific research and discovery. This is not new to anthropologists. Since the 1940s, when Ashley Montagu argued against the use of the term race in science, a growing number of scholars in many disciplines have declared that the real meaning of race in American society has to do with social realities quite distinct from physical variations in the human species. I argue that race was institutionalized beginning in the 18th century as a worldview, a set of culturally created attitudes and beliefs about human group differences. So, late 1700s, race and its ideology about human differences arose out of the context of African slavery, but many people throughout history have been enslaved without the imposition of racial ideology. When we look at the 17th century colonial America, before the enactment of laws legitimizing slavery only for Africans and their descendants after 1660, several facts become clear. The first people that the English tried to enslave and place on plantations were the Irish, with whom they'd had hostile relations since the 13th century. Okay, Irish people, you be the slaves. We're not going to be the slaves. We're busy getting clean with this Irish Spring. Some Englishmen had proposed laws enslaving the poor in England and in the colonies that forced them to work indefinitely. That's fair. Most of the slaves on English plantations in Barbados and Jamaica were Irish and Indians. Number 4. Many historians point out that African servants and bonded indentured white servants were treated much the same way. They often joined together, as in the case of Bacon's Rebellion, 1776, to oppose the strict and oppressive laws of colonial government. In the latter part of the 17th century, the demand for labor grew enormously. It had become clear that neither Irishmen nor Indians made good slaves. That's hilarious. Like, there are some people who make good slaves. More than that, the real threats to social order were the poor freed whites who demanded lands and privileges that the upper class colonial governments refused. Some colonial leaders argued that turning to African labor provided a buffer against the masses of poor whites. Until the 18th century, the image of Africans was generally positive. They were farmers and cattle breeders. They had industries, arts and crafts, and government and commerce. In addition, Africans had immunities to old world diseases. They were better laborers, and they had nowhere to escape to once transplanted to the New World. The colonists themselves came to believe that they could not survive without Africans. When some Englishmen entered slave trading directly, it became clear that many of the English public had misgivings about slave trading, and recreating slavery on English soil. It was an era when the ideals of equality, justice, democracy, and human rights were becoming dominant features of Western political philosophy. Those involved in the trade rationalized their actions by arguing that the Africans were heathens after all, and it was a Christian duty to save their souls. By the early part of the 18th century, the institution was fully established for Africans and their descendants. Large numbers of slaves flooded the southern colonies and even some northern ones. Sometimes they outnumbered whites, and the laws governing slavery became increasingly harsh. Well, that's interesting. Interesting stuff. So, those of you watching, it turns out I'm not just making this shit up at all, right? I mean, I knew from Jones Day. I read a couple things before. I am a debate coach. I do research some shit. So, but it's obvious regardless. And this is what I keep telling people in general about evidence. Evidence is the one among the less important things in successfully being convincing about arguing a position. Like, one of the most beginner things that people know is to say, well, you don't have any evidence for that, or do you have any evidence for that? The thing is, we're never arguing. We ought not be arguing so much about the descriptive realities of things that are quantifiable. Like, we don't need to know whether or not something is true or false as much as we need to know whether or not something is falsifiable. So it's you want to go as high up there as possible as a general rule. I want you to critique ideas rather than indenture yourself to them. And this is true for all persons who hear my voice. I have a wish for you. I wish for you, no matter how enlightened, wise, smart you are, be you 1,000 times more than I in all those matters. I wish for you to care about the highest level of ideas, and I wish for you to be harmed by any tendency to cling to ideas and make them your own. Let me correct that. To cling to specific notions and make them your own without adequate diligence. I think it's very important for each of us to make some ideas part of their ontology. So this is part of my ontology. This idea that discursive processes are the salvation of the world. That the ability of an individual talking to another individual, or talking to an audience like this, to impact their ability to cognate more broadly, or more effectively, or more accurately, is the best thing you can do for humanity. Because it's difficult to conceive of a future that goes well, that doesn't begin with a change in consensus. So it's generally no longer considered polite to make a bunch of nigger jokes. The reason people are not overtly racist in the way that they used to be is because of shame. And the reason that they're ashamed of it is because those arguments have lost already amongst all reasonable people. So it's no reasonable person is going to agree that it's fair to argue that cops should be allowed to shoot black people without consequence because black people are dirty criminals anyway. If I then ask you, well, who counts as black people? Then you end up with a definition like we have in Jones A or something like that. Anybody who's not a white person, they're black. Well, who's a white person? Well, a white person has been held to be an Armenian born in Asiatic Turkey, a person of about 1/16th Indian blood and Assyrian, but not to include Afghans, American Indians, Chinese, Filipinos, Hawaiians, Hindus, Japanese, Koreans, Negroes. Nor does white person include a person having 1/4 of African blood, a person in whom Malay blood predominates, a person whose father was a German and mother was Japanese, a person whose father was a white Canadian and whose mother was an Indian woman, or a person whose mother was a Chinese and whose father was the son of a Portuguese father and a Chinese mother. We have a wonderful definition like that. For those of you who are watching live, if you've been watching a long time, you may hear me recapping some things again. I want to do that because I want to make sure that as long as I'm live streaming, as people drop in, they get the gist of my message here, which is that race does not exist, that it's not even a social construct, really. It's just an abusive non-label that people use to ascribe unwillingly onto others attributes that they perceive must go along with their phenotype. So I read something from this and yada, yada, yada. Let me look at the chat over here. Let's see if there's anybody in the chat. Chatting. Oh, Bojo, you're such a troll. You're the only one chatting. If you'd like to join me here in room Mia, then you should do so. It's appear.in/TWFP2. You can join me, host Eric, and ask me questions. Or you yell at me. If I'm always down to be yelled at. Look at this fun rock I found. Have you ever seen such a fun rock? It's neato.
Oh, that is a fun rock. I'm having fun just looking at it.
Yeah, it's a fun one. So I was really happy to find this one. This one, Kimberly calls it my penis rock, but it's really the metaphysician's stone is what I've named it. It's a stone. Your job is you hold it and you muse about why you're holding it.
Because holding your penis in public is just inappropriate.
I'm not holding a penis. I've got an extra thumb. I've got 2 thumbs and 4 fingers. Pow! It really fits well in your hand, is the thing. See, it's got like different angles, and each of the angles fits well in your hand. It's a nice stone. Like, you can hold it like this, fits perfectly right here, you know? This little, yeah, I don't know if you can see it, but yeah, you see it like there, like, yeah. And it fits right there. See how nice that is? This rock is a black rock. It's an African American rock. It's Afro-American rock.
I think African American rocks are somewhat larger than that.
Well, it's a cold morning. We also had Afro-American cats. Kimberly's old cat Nora had jet black kittens. I called them the Afro-American cats. And then she also had 2 gray kittens. And in fact, we kept one of them. Schmitty Rensel is one of them. They didn't get named. See, they're a little bit less defined. I didn't have a race for them. The Afro-American cats, though, well, it's self-evident. They're Afro-American cats. Oh, and you're a Schmitty Rensel cat. Yes, you are a Schmitty Rensel. What race is Schmitty Rensel? Gray. You're a gray.
Alien.
Alien. You're an alien kitty. If there ever was an alien kitty, this one is. This kitty is so FE. It's just like lathering the FE on. Hello, good morning, and how do you do? I'm host Eric, and how are you? I guess I scared her away. She must have been a black person. They are easily frightened. Or Chinese, they're also easily frightened. So, yeah, we're talking race, we're talking America, we're talking Charlottesville, we're talking Trump. We're talking who's responsible for the violence. Both sides or just one side? Your stupidity. That's what's responsible for the violence. Let's look at some comments from the YouTube channel. There was a couple I wanted to highlight in a video. I might as well do it now while I'm live streaming. Let's see. Going to the dashboard. I'm going to the dashboard as a Mexican. I'm going to access the community section as a Native American. And I'm going to scroll down as an Eskimo. That's great. Mega Bro puts 1 hour 14 minutes. I identify his FI protect relation in Mega Bro's system.
And I'm also I find her precious. I have strong FI towards her. So I find myself preventing harm towards her. For example, when she walked down the rocks at Big Bear, I was atypically, and wondering why I was doing this, like hovering around her, making sure she didn't trip or fall down these rocks. Because I was afraid she was going to hurt herself. It's kind of a steep way to get down. And, I realized...
here's a question I had for you.
Harm prevention.
Eating in public, is it SE or SI dominant activity?
Eating in public, is it SE or SI dominant activity? Well, okay. Eating in public for me is SIFE. So it's like depending on how hungry I am. So last night, Kimberly and I went to Norm's for dinner, and we were both exhausted and starving, and we basically didn't talk at all on the way there. And then we sat down and we started eating our soup when we got it, and it was like that's SI. It was pure SI. But a lot of times when I go out to eat, it's more of an FE thing. Like it's fun to go hang out together at the restaurant and try some new food or something like that. You know, that's more of an FE or just a general. Yeah, I guess FE or FI maybe. FI is always a tricky one. So yeah, I don't know about the SE. I don't know. It's like eating in public being SE would mean like I'm gonna clown around and put ice cream on my face, or I'm gonna start a food fight or something, or let's have sex in the whipped cream.
Well, here's the reason I ask. I was on the beach reading yesterday, and I was having a sandwich as well beforehand, and noticed that I was okay while I was eating, and there was nobody coming across. I was eating my sandwich. It was a Subway, so it's like, you've got to really open wide to get a big mouthful, and it could go wrong. But most of the time, it doesn't go wrong, and it's fine. But then when people come into view, then it's like you get another. It's like another dimension comes into it, and it becomes uncomfortable. And then you sort of, because you're observing that it's uncomfortable, things start to go wrong, and you're less in flow eating.
So like cucumbers are flying from your sandwich.
Yeah, literally.
I can't eat anymore. That's
what it's like.
That's FE. That's stone cold, straight up FE. That's like being pee shy too. Like, oh shit, there's a bunch of people waiting to use the urinals. I better pee fast. You're sure to pee more slowly. Yeah, that's just FE. Being plagued by the fee, as they call it. But FE's pretty good, pretty satisfying as well. Then Kimberly and I have been. We resumed fighting yesterday. So we've been fighting now Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. I'm pretty sure it's over. But it's been a rough 4 days. And it's all about my FE mistake at that party and the ants and stuff like that. So it's interesting to see how this is played out from a couple of perspectives. One, my takeaway from this prolonged battle, is that certain things I'm just gonna have to change. Like, I need to change how I deploy anger. My first approach to things in general, if I feel as though you're being unfair, is to become angry, and it just doesn't work with her. She immediately puts up her I'm standing my ground, and she's pretty damn effective at not letting me force of will her around. So, and I appreciate that, because I don't want to be in that kind of relationship anyway. So I'm going to have to change my approach, is one thing I take away from it. Number two is I've got to understand that she has deep habits of bad discourse, dealing with people who were kind of not cool or not trustworthy or something. She has trouble accepting that when I'm pushing on something or being angry about something or insisting about a point or trying to pin her down, trying to get her to answer a question, I'm not trying to get her. Like, I'm not going to do anything with it. If I get her to agree that yes, okay, you're right about that. I'm not going to then do anything with that. I'm not looking to take that and then punish her with it, or take that and then exploit that to make her do blah or whatever. I just want us to talk to each other fairly. And if we talk to each other fairly, in general, I don't really care what happens. Like I so countervalue SE. It doesn't really matter if I get my way in the real world, as long as we agree that I'm right about something. And it's weird.
Just anything, something.
Well, like a lot of times I'll say, Kimberly and our fights will start with something minor, but then she'll say some unfair thing or some ridiculous thing, like she, you always blah 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 blah, or she'll say something like, I'll say, okay, you did X, and she'll say, yeah, but you might do X too, so we're the same. This is that's just it's something that she's never successfully had a relationship that talked out issues in dispute successfully and well. She doesn't know that it exists, basically. But that's why this fight's been extended so long, and why it's good that it happened and good that it extended such a long time, is I realize I have to stop. I have to stop. I have to remember that.
Yeah, you have to just stop.
I have to remember that I want to actually convince her. I don't want to use the method I normally use. The method I normally use is I will punish your bad arguments, and that's how I will help you.
Punishment.
Then you won't use those bad arguments anymore. I will punish your bad arguments by attacking those bad arguments, and then you won't use the bad arguments anymore. I don't want to do that with Kimberly.
Yeah, well, if you're dealing with somebody who is the victim of some kind of negative familial relationship, then punishing them isn't really going to do any great thing, really.
Right. Well, I mean, I'd like to think I'm never punishing the person. I'm always punishing the bad arguments. But people don't make that distinction very well. So, regardless, I don't want to do that with
their argument is what they're doing, their behaviors, who they've been being. So it's less conceptual to them.
Yeah, you're right. And I need to accept more of a reality. I need to, in general, accept the reality that when dealing with other adults, I still need to take on a teacher role regarding argumentation and not engage in it so much. Like, I have such faith in argumentation that I think that winning arguments has impacts on individual people that are necessarily good, regardless of how they feel about it. But even if that's the case, it's not necessarily the best way to get people to make the most progress with argumentation. So, regardless of anybody else, with Kimberly's also a special circumstance. Kimberly deserves, and I want a relationship in which we talk to each other kindly and calmly. And I just need to check the anger. It doesn't work here, and it's not the right tool to use, but it's such a default thing for me. I just default to it, and I need to, but I'm not going to anymore. I'm I'm just not going to.
Yeah, because you want to be in a position to support your spouse, don't you? Not,
I'm sorry, I had a sudden visitation of extreme noise. Can you say that again?
Well, you want to support your other half, rather than castigate them for what they're doing wrong. That
Right.
seems like a more congenial relationship.
You're right. Absolutely. The thing is, the engine I've decided in terms of how to not get angry is I just need to be non-reactive, because the thing is, I'll try to broach something in a really calm way, and then she'll get angry right away and try to shut down. Stop! And
Yeah.
then I'll usually react to that anger by getting angry back. That's where I have to stop the progression. So she's gonna get angry. I need to observe it and say, okay, this is the thing I'm working with her on. So I need to. Of course, she's gonna get angry, and I am not emotionally attached to this as an argument. In other words, I'm not going to deal with her in this moment as somebody who's being unfair to me. I'm going to deal with her in this moment as somebody who's exhibiting the thing that I'm trying to help her with. It's kind of a. It allows me to deal with it without being angry.
Yeah, because you start off with, you're coming at it from, I don't have any feelings in this game. And then, this is purely intellectual. And then when you don't get the response that you want, then it's like, give my fucking feelings.
Right, yeah. But I mean, the thing about anger is it's the cause of and solution to all life's problems. So I'm going to end this live stream right now. I'm going to start another live stream on that topic of anger in a little bit. Thank you for watching, Dr. Famous People. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese. And if you are really interested in a fun time, try becoming transracial like me. You'll discover that when you choose Chinese, you get free karate. Goodbye.